Thanks so much for coming today to celebrate the contributions of Jonathan and Ian. You can hear me, can't you? You can't? I'm not quite that soft-spoken. Well, if you put that on, do you want to? He should. Okay, you should. So this very special event where the speaker should put this on is essentially possible because of Society in Science Branko-Weiss Fellowship, Center for Neuroscience Zurich. It's an INI seminar, and it's also supported by Life Science Zurich and Collegium Helveticum. And I really thank Collegium Helveticum for adopting this event as their own. And I would like Gerd Folkers to introduce Ian and Jonathan. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Arco. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this very interesting, very inspiring event that we have today. We will hear a tandem lecture, kind of a tandem lecture of two persons that engaged deeply in a rare disease you have probably some knowledge about. I will very shortly go into the fact why the Collegium Helveticum is interested in that, and again I'm grateful that Arco contacted me and that we could team up to host here tonight. Our ongoing project for the next 5 years is on reproducibility and prediction, and all kinds of reproducibility are the essence of doing basic science. So reproducibility in all kinds and aspects of identifying yourself, identifying a unique unit, to differentiate that from clones, and to describe any kind of individuality is one of the questions that we follow now for the next years. And so far, of course, the question of how the body is represented in myself, and also the borderlines when talking about myself that I see around myself and I see in my body, is one of the important questions to describe individual actions, individual beings, and the reproducibility of this being myself. So I think that's more or less enough on our program. The Collegium Helveticum is a nice little old observatory not very far from here. If you ever have the chance to visit university clinics, make a stop over at the little observatory built by Semper, just 250 meters from here. This is Semper Gottfried, the famous one from the Dresden Opera, who was professor of architecture at the ETH at those times because he had to flee from Germany for political reasons. This is no longer the precondition to get a job at the ETH, so feel safe. The Collegium in itself is fostering interdisciplinary research. What do we mean by interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary research? We try to do it in a bottom-up structure. That means we have the privilege to elect 6 fellows, 3 from universities, 3 from ETH for a period of 5 years at a 20% workload, so 1 day per week. And we do that without any respect to the disciplines. So the fellows are elected just by their gorgeous personality. And then after they are elected, they are invited to discuss one topic, one interesting topic that they want to follow for the next 5 years with this 20% workload. So the very essential job is in the first 6 months to come up with one topic, and the topic of this period now is this reproducibility business, and you can imagine that we try to follow all kinds of aspects of this reproducibility. that may be enough. It's my pleasure now to introduce, in the order of appearance probably, I don't know exactly, Jonathan Cole. Jonathan Cole is a neurologist, medical doctor, is professor and consultant in the clinic in Poole, and he has written a wonderful book. You are probably aware about his collaboration and his insights and scientific insights upon the disease. The name is Bright and a Daily Marathon. And this is the story of the other protagonist of tonight. It's Ian Waterman, and how to introduce Ian Waterman. Ian Waterman became famous because he was sick, but he has become a prominent person not because he was sick, because he was able to overcome an absolute terrible and frightening disease that divested him of control of his bodily movements and in all of sense of touch. And by an, we will hear that, unprecedented mental exertion, he regained control and eventually taught himself to move again, as you can see. And which is the result that brought him here and join us and being part of our discussions tonight. That's amazing enough. And with these words, I would like to give the floor to the two gentlemen. We are happy to have you here. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you for the invitation to Arco. And thank you all for coming. I didn't know he had quite as many friends. This should really have read Living Without Touch, Movement and Position Sense. And I firmly believe that as a doctor looking after people with neurological impairment, I have to try and understand it using empirical science as best I can, and I'm going to describe some experiments. But I also need to understand what it's like to be another person in a particular position. So I have to ask them, and I have to ask them to listen and listen and listen and tease it all out. So I ought to thank Ian for allowing me just to listen and write about not only doing science with him, but also about his experiences, which are of themselves of interest and inform empirical science, I think, but also science in the OED just means knowledge. And science began before empirical lab-based science, and there's still a place just for the narrative case history, I think. So off we go. What we're going to do is I'm going to give a bit of science and a bit of background, and then every so often there'll be a video to keep you awake, and then if that's too boring, the videos, we're going to ask Ian to give a bit of commentary during our lecture. So we're going to do neuroscience, we're going to do phenomenology live. Okay, we hope. So here's the peripheral nervous system as it was dissected in 1728. But now, I don't know how many of you are physiologists or neurophysiologists. I'll assume not many. But if you look at a peripheral nerve, there are various classes of nerve cell according to how big they are, and the bigness of the nerve fibre, each individual nerve fibre, determines how fast it conducts. So there are different classes of nerve cell according to their diameter and their conduction velocity. And it just so happens that each class conducts information that is elaborated within the brain for the perception of different things. So the large nerve fibres, sensory nerve fibres, come from muscle spindles, tendon receptors, and from the skin, and they underpin the perceptions of joint position sense and muscle stretch and of touch. And movement and position sense is conventionally described as proprioception. Although, of course, not all of the information about movement becomes conscious. So I prefer, in a way, to talk about movement and position sense rather than proprioception. It's a slightly ambiguous term. The small nerve fibres do the rest, which is pain and temperature mainly, plus a bit of tension and cramp and fatigue. Okay, so Ian had an illness which we'll go into. As a result of that, from the neck down, his large myelinated nerve fibres, sensory nerve fibres, no longer work. So he doesn't have the sensations of joint position sense, movement sense, or touch from the skin below the collar line at the front and the back of the head at the back. We'll go into how that happened. But the sensations over here were unaffected, and crucially, the movement or motor nerves were not affected at all. But without the brain, without knowing where the arm is, which Ian doesn't if he has his eyes shut, the brain can't organise movement at all on its own. And quite how Ian has managed to overcome the lack of peripheral feedback is something we'll go into. Hopefully. How did it happen? Ian had a gastric infection, a virus. The virus was met by an antibody raised in the body, and that antibody then reacted against his nerve cells. And the sensory nerve cell bodies of the sensory nerves happen to be in a place here, which is the dorsal column, the dorsal root ganglion, which is just outside the spinal cord. This is the back, and that's the front, so it's upside down. But that is where the damage occurred. At each vertebral level, where each spinal nerve comes out and goes in, it happened, but not to the cranial nerves. Sir Charles Bell wrote a book in 1833 which described, for the first time, proprioception or movement and position sense. Sherrington termed the coin proprioception, but Bell actually described the problem. When a blind man stands upright, how does he know where he is? He has to adjust the muscles so that the limbs are stiffened. And there's no source of knowledge but a sense of the degree of exertion in his muscular frame to underpin that. He stands by such a fine expression of this power, and the muscles are so, from habit, directed with so much precision, with an effort so slight, that we don't know how he stands. Normally you don't think about standing. You're not sitting now thinking about sitting. But if you don't have feedback, you have to. Normally we're not aware of what we do. Of course, if we attempt to walk on a narrow ledge or stand where we're in danger, the actions of the muscles are magnified and demonstrative, to which they're excited. We're sensible to the position of our limbs. Although we touch or see nothing, there must be a property internal to the frame. And that's the internal awareness which Ian no longer has. When treating the senses and showing how one organ profits by exercise of another, and each is indebted to that of touch, the sensibility of the skin is most dependent of all on the exercise of another quality. Without the sense of muscular action or consciousness of degree of effort, the proper sense of touch could hardly be an inlet to knowledge at all. When you put your hand in your pocket to pick out a coin, you're always doing something called active touch. You're moving in relation to the sense you get of where you are in the pocket. Most of touch is an exploratory function, that you feel what you're doing and that determines what you do next. And in 1833, Bell was immediately aware that touch enables action, and action depends on touch. The two are almost impossible to separate. Here's a video of a man called CF who had the condition that we're talking about, acute sensory neuronopathy. He can't move, he can't feel touch or movement or position sense below the neck. And he was 60 when it happened, and you'll see him again in a little while. So he doesn't really know where this part of him is when he's doing that, and he's pretty well stuck. When he went out of that chair, he couldn't control what he was going to do when he hit the floor properly. He will perhaps talk about this. And this is GL, who's another subject with the same condition, only more affected in a way, because she can't feel from the lower part of the face and the whole of the neck either, because her level is just slightly higher. There are a few patients in the world like this that we're aware of medically, and some of them are studied in the literature rather more than others. And now I'm going to hand over to Ian to just briefly tell you a little about what happened.
Can I just ask one question?
Of course.
All these people that you're doing, these people you showed, they all had the same problem. They all had an infection that then...
So they all, yes, they all had an infective cause, but it wasn't always the same infection. There might be infectious mononucleosis, a virus, an unknown virus, but they all had, yes.
Good evening. Thank you very much for the invite. It's a pleasure to be here. It's an unusual situation for us to work together in this way, and this is, in fact, you'll be maybe delighted to hear, hopefully by the end of the evening you will be, that we've chosen here to launch it. But so maybe a little bit rusty in places, but please bear with us, and please, as this lady has, ask any questions as we go through. Anything, for me, nothing's off limits, so while we're here, as far as I'm concerned, all questions are valid. Please ask anything you wish to know, even the silly personal ones you can ask. You might not get an answer, but you have an invitation. Started off in Jersey. I'd gone over there as a young man, full of ambition to be a butcher. Maybe not an exciting life for vegetarians, but certainly it excited me. And I had a pretty good career out there. Got an infection. It presented itself as the flu, just a simple flu. I felt tired, very sluggish. I went to bed. I went to get up one morning, to get out of bed to freshen myself up, and fell out of bed. And I fell against a radiator, which was off. It was cold, as radiators are in the summer months. And I couldn't unravel myself. I couldn't immediately have stopped myself from falling out of bed, and I couldn't unravel myself from the package that I found myself in on the floor. And my landlady, I was living in a hotel at the time, and my landlady came in and she said, "What's up?" Thinking that some guys at my age at that time would be drinking quite a bit. And she thought that maybe this was an alcohol-related incident, which I assured her it wasn't. And we decided we'd call the doctor, and the doctor came out and I was quickly rushed into Jersey General. And from there on, things started to deteriorate, and that I lost all connection with anything from the neck down, really. We looked at what the issues were in the Channel Islands, and it's a smashing island, a lovely place to visit, thoroughly recommend it, nice people. But they don't have the best medical situation in the world, and so we were shipped off, or I was shipped off, to Southampton. And it's only when you start getting back into the real world again, I've been 6 weeks in this hospital and was then shipped off to Southampton, that I realised what I'd actually started to lose. Or what the loss was. I mean, they came in on the morning of the departure to Southampton and dressed me. I couldn't dress myself, I couldn't feed myself, I couldn't clean myself before I went to the toilet. They came in and dressed me, got me in an ambulance, and very kindly sat me in the corner of the ambulance, and we drove off. And as we went round the first corner, the ambulance went one way and I went the other. So that was something I'd lost that I didn't even know I had. And that, as Jonathan explained to me, is something called proprioception, the ability to manage those sort of things. And we ended up in Southampton, where I was looked at and prodded and poked, and the prognosis was pretty grim. The prognosis was that I wouldn't walk again. But what also became fairly apparent was that they didn't really understand what the condition was. They knew what the loss was, but they didn't understand how I got it, what the impact was going to be long term, other than I wouldn't walk again, and life was going to be resigned to a wheelchair. At the time that this information was given to me, it's a bit of a crass statement in a way, but it's a cliche and it's a true one. I really was the first disabled person I met, and I wasn't very happy about it. I was an arrogant, angry young man that suddenly having my career taken away from me, and I fought long and hard not to go into the wheelchair. But it seemed as though that was the way it was going to go for quite some time. Until I attended some physiotherapy clinics in the neurocentre in Southampton, but eventually was signed off and shipped home to be with my parents, and I spent quite a considerable amount of time with my parents at home. We moved a bed downstairs, and I couldn't manage stairs and get around very easily, so that was an easy hit. But I thought, well, we need to do something a little bit more long-term, let's push into oddstock. And oddstock really is where I started to explore what I had. I started to learn to stand. I started to learn to balance. And when I say I started to learn to stand, my physiotherapists were very good at building up muscle strength and giving me exercises to be able to do that, which was great, but that really wasn't the problem. It was the controlling of my muscles. And if my eyes were closed, I couldn't do things. If I was trying to feed myself, not that we do generally feed ourselves with our eyes closed, but you know, my hand would wander. If I was distracted during a conversation, with a conversation during eating, my hand would wander off. So I started to learn that I would have to attend to all movement if I wanted to control it and not only be safe by myself, but not spill things over people that happen to be sat next to you. So, you know, I started to explore oddstock, and we started there learning to balance. And I was put in front of some wall bars, all familiar with those. We have them in schools and gyms and wherever. And I literally spent hours in front of that just learning to stand. Just standing. I had my wheelchair here, I had the bars in front of me, I put my brakes on, and I learned to stand. And it took a long time before I could actually stand, and stand safely. Well, I was pretty pleased with that. I thought that was quite an achievement. My physios thought, well, let's just leave him to his own devices. He seems quite happy. There's less trouble that way. So they let me practice my standing. But once I'd learned to stand, I wanted to explore doing other things. And no one had told me that if you stick an arm out, you actually slightly incline to one side to take up the... I didn't do physics. So I found this out for myself, because as soon as I put an arm out, I fell over. And very soon learned that one would have to start controlling all sorts of things I hadn't even been aware of. That some other system inside me had taken control of and looked after since I was a tot. And I built up, as I tumbled and fallen as a little babe. You know, you learn all these things, but that had gone, and I now had to put those in place. And what I replaced it with was vision and cognitive effort. And the simple act of standing never has been simple again. It's something that I have to think about. Sitting in a chair, we sit in our chairs and we're quite comfortable, and we're hopefully absorbed in a lecture. But you know, for me, if I became distracted, I'd probably fall out and maybe end up on the floor. So if I fall asleep, I won't know if your proprioception will keep you in place. But I'm not quite sure which is the next slide that's coming up. But I think it might be something around movement and standing. Let's move on and have a look. I remember tensing very, very much the tummy muscles and just sort of sitting up, and I would fold up in the middle and just never get anywhere. But after a lot of practice and a lot of effort, I actually learned this technique to just sort of like lift the head, move the shoulders forward and sit up. I remember vividly the first time I sat up, I was so euphoric, I lost all control and almost fell out of the bed again, because I just lost control about keeping the tummy muscles tight and all that sort of thing. And that simple act of sitting up in bed was the key to how movement was going to have to be if it was going to be controlled for the rest of my life. That I would have to plan it before I did it, that I'd have to structure it in my mind and work my way through it. And that's how it is today. It hasn't changed. And it hasn't, if you could stop there please, John. It hasn't changed. I still have to apply those strategies today. When I sit up in bed in the morning, I have to think about where things have moved to. And I would do that by moving the leg and feeling something cold. I think, oh, that leg must have been in that position. And you know, by a method of, subtraction and effort, you work out where you are, and you start to piece things together, and you then start to sit up. But the process that I found here and explored here is exactly the same today. It's a little more subtle, and hopefully it's not quite as obvious and labelled as it used to be, but it's the same principle. And that's how I manage movement. Everything has to be planned through and managed with eyesight. So I will send a command. I'm pretty arrogant, so I believe it's going to do it. If I tell it to do it, usually it does, but I have to monitor and make sure with vision. I'm not sure which picture goes on to.
You're talking now.
Am I? I've just done that.
Shoelace, we were quite happy with it in the first place. Let's pull back that or redo it. Okay?
Been doing shoelaces, took years.
Talking in about a year to stand. And he spent hours doing things like jigsaw puzzles,
A good mic stand as well.
paper clips, anything to improve dexterity.
And dear God, it took 12.
This is Charles Freed again.
Well, there you go. I mean, that's... Exactly, you owe me $2 for that.
But all these simple tasks, such as doing the button, sitting up, all these things take cognitive effort. And this is Charles being assisted by one of the chaps out there. And I used to walk in a similar sort of fashion, but it took years to get to that sort of stage to do it unaided. It took me a year to learn to stand and work out what the virtues were of standing. It sounds crazy now, but it was a year well spent, I think.
Relax.
I've had many years of walking around perfectly.
Just get steady, be happy.
It's surprising the amount of effort that goes into these simple tasks, standing, doing a button, getting something out of your pocket. There are some things I never do. I never get things out of my pocket. Ask Jonathan, he pays for everything. But, you know, there are some things that you let go of and work out very quickly, which it's easy to let go of. Getting things out of the pocket's not a big issue. Standing and being independent, absolutely crucial to me. I spend a lot of time doing
It
that.
seems like it is lifting. Okay, we'll lean over. The reason for that, Charles, I'll show you. Just a sec. The reason it's not lifting.
I used to walk long distances, not very gracefully, a lot of effort going into it, but, you know, I was mobile and can still walk now, but I get backache quite chronically now, so that's the issue for not standing. But I was trying to get Charles to learn about shifting his weight and thinking about where he was going and what he wanted to do, and planning.
One of the things that people without feedback get is ataxia. You can see Charles is shaking and unsteady in what he does, everything he does. One of the first things Ian had to learn was how to stop ataxia. I'll do the next video, which is you walking.
Okay.
Oh, no, Tell about ataxia.
Right. One of the problems I had in doing fine dexterous tasks was that my hands would wander a phenomenal amount. They would shake and they would never go where I wanted them to go. And so I set myself some tasks of trying to learn to control what was there. And I could control it with vision. So I would spend many hours, literally many hours, touching my nose, touching my knee, touching my nose, touching my knee. And I built a rhythm in doing this, and we just worked and worked at it. Then I would put another object in that corner, this one, that, and monitoring it and watching it the whole way through. And it was only by learning what virtues I had and had left to play with that I was able, and how I needed to manage them, that I was able to control it and be much more dexterous today. Charles asked us about, if he could learn to do a couple of tasks. One of the things he wanted to do is to learn to do buttons. And so we had an exercise, we did have some film of that, I don't think it's with us today, but we spent some time learning how to do buttons. I don't know if you got the paperclip one, but we also spent some time learning how to do paper clips. And it was very simple once you broke it down to what you were trying to do. And when Charles was trying to work with his paper clips, his hands were moving quite vigorously. He was trying to grasp with all his hands and fingers, and everything was getting in the way, and he clearly wasn't focused. We did a simple thing of putting a metronome, passionate about music. So we worked with what he liked music, and we put a metronome out there which went to a beat. And we got him to work with a beat. And that was very simple. He went from here to here to here, and he did it like that. He got it very, very quickly, just because we put a focal point there. And when we got the focal point there, and he was more focused, he was then able to manage and control what he wanted to do. And so when we gave him some paper clips, his hands were moving all over the place, trying to thread them together. And And what we did, or what I did, was I got him to put his hands down on the corner of the box, I think it was, and we put all the other fingers away that he didn't need, and we just worked with finger and thumb, and we worked with those, and we got him to thread all paper clips, and he was doing it in a very, very short space of time, something that he hadn't been able to do for a long time. And it was all because we stripped it down to its bare essentials and got him to focus while we did it. While we were doing this, plane went over, he was distracted and his hands all over the place again. So as soon as you let go of that focus of what you want to do, then it goes out the window. It's as fragile as that. For myself, if I can be whatever normal is, I can go about my normal day and do whatever I need to do. But if I have a cold or a headache, or I'm particularly a bit run down or whatever, then I lose the edge. I constantly live at the peak of what I can do because that's the way I am. Sorry, please.
I have a question. How can you split your consciousness? How can you sit upright plus not fall over plus control the movement of your hands and all this if you have to concentrate on all the movements?
Very good question. You break it down into things that you apportion certain things. For example, to be here, sat in the chair, I know that I'm in the chair, I know how far I can lean without getting into a dangerous position. So I've learned that because I've fallen out a fair few times. So that's something that you would learn. So that's something I have, and I attend to it. While I'm talking to you, I'm still attending to how far I'm leaning over. I gesture a lot, you may have noticed, There are not that many of them, but I throw them around. But I do move a fair bit, but I'm always aware as to how far I can go with that. So that's something I've learned. That's one piece of the picture that I'm presenting, so that's one bit. As for the gesture, we have lots of debates about that, funnily enough, but I have a repertoire of movements that I like, of gestures that I like. There are a lot of automatic ones in there, but there are quite a few sweeping gestures that I do. But when you think about those, that's easy, because that's, it's just an act really, because there's no fine end point. If I was doing something like stopping to touch a fine point or to do something dexterous, I would then start attending to that. I will never move while I was trying to do that. So you start breaking it down to things that you need to attend to. I mean, someone very kindly came in with a bottle head. I would never do that and sort of have a hand there and a hand here and have a chat and what have you. That's just, it gets messy. It gets messy. So you learn to apportion. If you were to watch, it's a boring thing to do, if you were to watch a video, you'd see that the gestures are very, very limited. They're just structured in a way that they're not precise. Jonathan has a very good chat on that. If you want to,
It's not quite next.
but it's not quite next.
It's not quite next. We'll come on to a bit about gesture. In terms of movements, Jacques Paillard and Robert Forget, I put this slide up. By morphokinetic movements, it's a shape of a movement, which doesn't have to be accurate in place. So it can be accurate in time and it can be accurate in shape, but it doesn't have to be accurate in place, like picking something up, as Ian said. Morphokinetic movements are relatively easy, but if you have to go to a place in the external world, that requires much more thought for Ian. And we did an example with GL and Ian when they were together, and you can see that GL is very good at writing Ian's name with her eyes open, and she can write all the shapes with her eyes shut, but she doesn't think to move her hand across the page with her eyes shut, because she hasn't really got that's what she needs to do. The morphokinetics are there, but the topokinetics are not. And we did the same with Ian, and Ian's very awkward because he knew what we were doing, so he slowed down sufficiently that he could preserve going across the page properly. So we had to make him either really slowing, so he got the T off the paper, or really fast. And even then, he got all the going across the page properly, and only really came unstuck when he had the end of a certain phrase that he was making. So there's two sorts of movements that Jacques Paillard suggested that shed some light on it. Ian talked about walking, and the purpose of this slide is to show you how long we've been working together. And this is me with all the abilities, all the EMG, and there are also small infrared sensors, such that you get sticks. And these are shoulder, hip, knees, foot, from the side on as someone walks. And I'm there, and Ian's here, and I'm not that normal either, but I'm roughly normal, because I'm Olive. But these are to show the differences that Ian has in his walking, which are that he has to, we'll show Ian walking in a minute, he has to lean further forward to see his head during, so his head can see his body, during walking. So his trunk isn't as vertical as you and I. And he won't trust his weight to be borne on a bent knee, so he has to have a straight leg. He doesn't rise up on his ankle because verticality is a problem and he doesn't trust his ankle properly. So he lifts off more from the foot and he lands more on the foot than you and I do. And in order, so that to avoid tripping over his toes when he's on the through phase of walking, he has to abduct the hip. Sorry, you can't see the abducting the hip. From the front. Yeah. From the front. That's me trying to be normal with the foot extending in front of me in one line, and that's Ian bending his knee outwards so that he can turn his foot outwards so he can see it and not trip up on it. I would say slightly like Chaplin. And
yesterday you said very like Chaplin.
Or, I mean, he wasn't there then. Thank you, Kevin. Rather like Chaplin. And this is Ian walking, and he might talk you through this. We just happened to be at NASA filming.
Not the most elegant of walks in the world, but it worked for me. It still does work for me. Quite a lot of effort going into it. You have to monitor what's happening all the time. From the standing, you'd be monitoring ahead where you're going. It's like a chess game. I can't play chess, but it's, as I imagine a chess game would be, you are planning ahead constantly. Fairly easy when there's nothing ahead of you and you've got a film crew by the side, everybody gets out of your way. It's rather difficult if you're trying to do it on a busy railway station and you're late for the work that you're trying to get to that day.
An athlete will train and train and train for certain competitions, and that's their peak, and that's what they strive for. I work at my peak every day. It sounds dramatic and almost an over-the-top statement, but it's not. I live at the edge, for want of a better term, all day, every day. There's no leeway.
The simplest of actions continue over. Shopping becomes an exercise in mechanics.
Swedes are quite funny. Sometimes they're good size that can be really heavy, or quite light. Quite strange beasts, I think. And that can do an awful lot to your balance. I'll get into a safe position from the feet. I'll freeze my legs quite rigidly so that I know they're not going to move around a lot. Freeze the upper torso a little bit so that I'm in a safe, good, rigid position. I can now start hanging off of that frame other movement. But I have to be aware that it's a heavy object. And the law of physics says that if you have a heavy object extended from a narrow base, you're going to topple over. So you actually have to think, or I have to think consciously, about what picking up that object is going to do to this framework.
To make it easier to run in twigs, which I didn't disgrace myself as I just did here, picking up a drink and spilled it over myself. But yeah, I mean, simple tasks of shopping you have to plan ahead. You have to have a fair bit of energy to be able to take on the task. And I think a little bit about coping with disability. It took me a long time to accept that there would be some days when I just didn't want to go shopping. I may have a bare cupboard at home, but there were some days when I just didn't have the energy to go around the supermarket. And I would get very angry with myself about that. But you have to be kind to yourself as well. I'm very hard on my harshest critic, but you also have to be kind to yourself. In that, there are going to be days when you can't do it. And you have to accept that. But as long as those are fewer than those when you can do it, it's not a bad thing. That took a lot of learning, that little bit of thing. But yeah, I mean, standing and moving and carrying weights and all that, a big problem. I remember once being compromised. I bumped when I worked in an office. I worked once for the civil service in the UK, and I met my boss in the car park and he thrust in my hand towards me, some papers in a briefcase, and said, "Can you just take those into the office for me?" It was blowing me again and raining, it wasn't the best environment in the world, and I was in quite a difficult position, but I didn't want to let myself down. I was exhausted, having to think about all this extra weight and what have you. It's not a given, and it's easier than it used to be, but it's nowhere as easy as it is for you chaps.
Okay. Can you say something about the eggs?
Yeah.
Or the bottle or whatever, because clearly there are many things where you've got to have the compliance in our case that you don't have.
Well, to pick up drinks
To know that you have to put this amount of effort into the thing. So
I'll tell you a story. I used to work in an office, and there was a very nice lady that worked there called Hillary, and I've been trying to engage her in conversation for a long time, but believe it or not, I was a little bit shy. She was wandering past, going to a drinks machine, and said, "Would you like a drink?" "Yes, please." And she came back with a hot chocolate and a coffee, and she sat down, we were having a conversation, and she said to me, "You're not drinking your drink." And my reason was, though I didn't tell her, I was worried about picking it up because the cup was one of those soft plastic cups that was very fragile. And I knew it was going to be a problem. And I thought, well, I can't make her think as though she's wasted her time. So I did a stupid thing and went to pick it up and spilled it. And we had a long conversation while she mopped it up and was very kind to me. But what I did was I picked up some of those empty cups and went home that evening and practiced and learned how to pick them up without embarrassing yourself, which was to find the drink and someone would present the drink to you. I have never, or very, very rarely, taken a drink from anybody's hand. I always ask them to put it on the table. I'm then in control. I am a control freak. I then put my hand out. I will freeze a position with my hand, and I know that I can do that and it's not going to crush the cup. As I lift my hand, the cup will settle into it, and I can then freeze that posture and have a chat and not have a drink down again. But I have to monitor all the way out. It's a little ballet of movement really, and then you watch where it is, you observe, you work out what you want to do, you watch yourself doing it, you monitor it out, you monitor it back, and you put it back and nothing spilled. A few moments ago I just spilled my water into like that because I was listening to what Jonathan was saying. You know, such a dangerous fellow he is. But does that help? Is that...
So everything you calibrate?
Yeah, basically, yeah.
So tomatoes, eggs...
Yep. I keep rare breeds of poultry, so I work with eggs quite a lot of the time. And 2 days ago, I dropped the first one that had a chick in it, and I was mortified that I killed a chick unnecessarily because of my clumsiness. And it is very, very rare that I will be clumsy. But I know what the virtue is of an egg, and a tomato, and an apple. And you know you're applying thought processes to how much effort do I need to put in to slice the apple or to cut bread or what have you. You know, so there's a lot of things going along in the background, as well as the positioning sweet and stretch over too far and cut some. I mean, I used to be a butcher for many years, and you know, my disability denied that career path for me. But I recently, we now keep pigs on the farm, and you know, we now butcher our own pigs again. So I've learned how to manage. You know, we don't do it in quite the same way as I used to, or as quick as I used to. Could never make a career move out of it again. But we can actually butcher our own meat now, which is good. I was quite pleased to be able to do.
So there is one instance where you are not so much in control. It's when you're shaking someone's hand.
Yes.
And you do that rather well.
It's true.
So how is that?
Well, you see someone approaching you. The one shaking hands isn't too difficult because you know that quite often there's a force from them that could throw you off balance, so you just tense up for it. It's much easier when you're sitting down because it's very hard to be pulled over or knocked over. It's very difficult when you're standing and someone comes up and shakes your hand. The worst one, as long as you're planning, as long as you're aware of it coming up, you can tense at the right time and shake a hand and be quite effective, hopefully. Where it becomes difficult is if someone comes along and says, "Oh, well done," and pats you on the back, and you didn't see it. over you go. You know, I mean, that's where you're not in control. But I would very rarely put myself in a position where I couldn't get out. So if I go to eat in a restaurant, I'll make sure I have a table near the door so that I'm not going to get boxed in by the time I want to leave. And then I would, if I was at a party, I would be in an area where I'm less likely to be bumped or not, or I'll be sat down. You know, so you lose spontaneity with this gift, but you know, there are conversations, but you know, you can get around. You know, you can overcome them. There are ways around it.
I have a question related to this. When you say you plan the movement or you think about the movement, what is it more exactly that you think about? Is it something like really a sense of effort, or is it more like an image of your position, or do you have any specific imagery that goes with this?
It's a very good question, and my technical partner has a very good answer.
There's a bit of data, if we get to it, about functional imaging during Ian doing a simple task. I think Ian uses several things. He rehearses activity in his mind again and again and again, and that's a visual modality thing. When he's thinking about doing something, he imagines doing it. How do you imagine it? You visualize it as well. There's some evidence that the act of visualizing it allows him to fasten on to how to do it in some way. But he doesn't always know what he intends to do is actually going to happen. So he has to presume that's the case, and he needs some sort of feedback to make sure it's running and he wants it to. And he uses, we talk about visual supervision rather than visual feedback, because visual feedback can only be updated 3 times a second. Roughly, it's too slow to guide action. And there's some evidence for that. It differs between GL, and Charles, who are slower, who tend to use online visual feedback. So they tend to guide themselves through the world more slowly. Whereas Ian is running the forward programs, which he's had to think about and elaborate. But what's difficult to really get at is, although he has these programs he rehearses, he doesn't have skills the way you and I do, so that he never has automatic programs he doesn't have to think about. So it's a slightly different situation, which hopefully there'll be some data on. One of the intriguing things was when Ian picks up a weight, say a container, how does he know how heavy it is? And we've done some work on that. If Ian's hand is on something, and therefore he's not making any effort, I can put a huge weight on him without him knowing how heavy it is, because he doesn't have the perception in the skin or in the subcutaneous tissue of pressure like that. But as soon as the hand is not supported, he will begin to feel something. His liminal difference for a weight being heavier or lighter is about 100%, and yours is 5% with eyes shut if I put a weight on your arm. So he's got some awareness, and to be honest, he's got some small receptors that may tell him about tension or something. But as soon as you put a big weight out here, his posture will move and his neck will be alerted to it and his inner ear will be. So it's really difficult to separate the head segment receptors, which are completely normal, from the peripheral receptors here, unless you do it at a finger, and then he's really hopeless. It's more interesting what happens when you can see the object, but you don't know how heavy it is. And this is the situation we did with GL, and that's Jacques Payard, in front. And we've got different weights which are concealed here, and there are liminal differences of 5%. And each time Jeanette picks up a weight, these Plato specs stop her seeing it. So then she's really bad at it. She's 100% like Ian is. But when she sees it, she's about 5%. So how does she do that? Well, what she does is she makes a certain movement that she's learned. She can make that movement. And then it's how far she goes and how fast her arm moves. And if it's a slow weight, it doesn't go as far and it goes slower. So she's observing her arm move visually to see whether it's heavier or lighter. So her perception of the arm moving is available to us. So we should be able to say whether the weight's heavier or lighter by observing her lifting up the arm. And we did that, and we had Jeanette doing that, and a group of chaps round here with a clipboard deciding whether or not weight A, B or C was heavier or lighter. And GL lifted the weight up and did this. And then she put the weight down. And I was pretty good at the perception because I knew what she was doing. But I asked her, okay, you do that, and you can judge whether that's further or faster than the previous one. But why don't you do all the other movements? Because I thought you've lost your reference by then. I said, oh yes, I do that to make the judgment. I do all the others to confuse you lot. So that's how they can get round something like that. One of the immediately, Charles Bell, coming up to him, he asked whether the condition of the muscles, movement and position feedback, came purely from the muscles or came from consciousness of the degree of effort directed to them in the will. 1833. In neuroscience, we're still trying to explore the extent to which peripheral feedback guides action and the extent to which efferent's copy or awareness of the motor program we're sending out guides action. Some suggest one thing, some suggest the other. One of the first things we did with Ian was to ask him just with the finger, go underneath this towel, Ian, put your finger on a strain gauge, press down a certain amount and keep it there, without knowing how much force and without knowing what was going on under there. Just do it. Because John Rothwell and his group had found a subject with a neuropathy, a pan-sensory neuropathy, so not as selective as Ian's, but he was asked to make a position or a force at the fingers, and as soon as vision is removed, 2 or 3 seconds after, because there's a motor memory of 2 or 3 seconds, he goes up or down and he's not aware of it, whereas you and I can maintain it, because we have peripheral feedback. So we did it with Ian. He was able to do this. We actually gave up after 3 minutes. He can do that. And we're still not entirely sure how. But recently, we've got some evidence from this experiment that there may be some central perception of force or effort. The experiment is to press down with the thumb hard here on a cantilevered thing so that you press down and this weight goes up around 500 grams. And then you have to decide how hard you're pressing and press the same with the other side. So you match one side with the other. And then what we did with Ian was we fatigued the muscle. And by fatigue, we fatigued it so it was weak. And we fatigued the muscles so hard it was only half as strong as it was to start with. And then we asked Ian, your muscle is really half as strong, so how much matching weight do you think it should be on the other side? And the answer for Ian is when his muscle is half as strong as it should be, he matches it with double the weight on the other side. Controls do the opposite. When they're fatigued, they match it with a lesser weight on the other side. When they've got a tired muscle, they think the weight that muscle is having to lift is less, whereas Ian thinks it's twice as heavy. And we interpret that a fatigued muscle, the muscle fibers are fatigued, but the muscle spindles are fatigued too. And that in control subjects, they're tending to use the peripheral muscle spindle input to tell them how hard they're pressing, how hard the muscle's working. Whereas Ian, without that spindle input, is actually monitoring how hard he's having to press. And because the muscle's half as strong now, because it's fatigued, he thinks he's having to put twice as much effort into it.
So Ian, did you feel mentally fatigued when doing that task?
Can I be perfectly honest?
Yeah.
I can't remember it.
Yeah.
One of the problems when you're a guinea pig is that you do a lot of this stuff, and it's fascinating. You love it, you guys, and it's great. And if ever you invite me to do something like this, I will do it enthusiastically. But as I say to all the researchers that we ever work with, that I ever worked with, I will give you 100, 110%, absolutely. But when I leave the door and go out the room, I will forget it completely. That's not in rude or ignorance or I don't care. It's just I've got a lot of other things on my mind, like how am I going to get you down the corridor, where's the nearest coffee? So I tend to forget this stuff, you know. I'm a little more interested than I used to be, because some of this stuff has become painful over the years. So you start to engage a little more than you used to. You know, when I first used to go and see Jonathan, let's go back a step further. Why did I choose to work with Jonathan? And he can leave the room now for 2 minutes while I, you know, wax lyrical about him. But I hadn't seen a neurologist for 11 or 12 years. 11 or 12 years. And I'd had a bad back, and my doctor said to me, go and see a neurologist. Went to the neurology department.